She was a woman who hid behind the silent rhythm of her needle and thread, believing her quiet shop was a sanctuary from the world's cruelty. But when a stranger walked through her door, a man with eyes like polished steel and a secret that could topple a kingdom, she didn't realize that her peaceful existence was about to be burned to the ground. What she said to him about the dreaded general in the dead of night didn't just surprise him. It left him utterly silent and changed the course of their lives forever. Stay until the end to discover how a simple artisan became the greatest threat to a man who thought he ruled the world. Lyra's shop was a sanctuary of soft light and the lingering scent of dried jasmine, tucked away in the deepest corner of a village, forgotten by the hurried world of the capital. Every morning, as the first amber rays of dawn kissed the dust motes dancing in the air, she would meticulously arrange her hand-stitched linens and intricate embroidery, treating each thread as if it were a fragile promise preserved against time. The rhythmic sound of her silver needle passing through fine fabric was the only music she knew, a steady, grounding heartbeat that defined the boundaries of her solitary existence. She possessed an innate elegance that transcended her humble life, a quiet dignity that earned her the quiet admiration of the villagers, even if they often whispered about why a woman of her poise chose such a secluded path. Lyra found profound comfort in the anonymity of her craft, believing that by remaining small and unnoticed, she could shield herself from the volatile tides of the aristocratic world that had once brought only sorrow to her lineage. Her shop was far more than a place of commerce. It was a fortress, constructed with the immense patience of someone who had learned that silence was the most reliable form of protection. However, the serenity of her morning ritual was on the verge of being irrevocably altered by an arrival that felt both mundane and momentous. As she stood near the frosted window, adjusting a heavy drape of charcoal-colored wool, the iron-hinged door creaked open, casting a long, unfamiliar shadow across her polished floorboards. A man stepped inside, his attire plain and layered with the grit of a long journey. Yet his presence seemed to swallow the small space whole, instantly shifting the atmosphere from tranquil to heavy, with an unidentifiable, brooding tension. If you love stories where the quietest voices hold the most power, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single chapter of this journey. The stranger moved with a deliberate, measured stride, his keen eyes scanning the shop not as a patron would, but as a strategist assessing a critical point on a map. He wore a simple charcoal-gray traveling coat, frayed at the cuffs and stained by the heavy rain of the road, which did little to mask the powerful, athletic frame hidden beneath the coarse wool. His dark hair was windswept, clinging to a forehead creased by deep thought, and his jaw was set in a firm, unrelenting line that hinted at a lifetime of command and unwavering resolve. Lyra paused, her breath catching in her throat, though she quickly masked her surprise with a composed, professional nod, clutching her apron tightly. She noted the distinct calluses on his palms, not those of a tradesman or a weary field laborer, but the specific, hardened skin of a man accustomed to holding the hilt of a heavy blade for countless hours. There was a dangerous magnetic aura about him, a silent weight that seemed to deplete the air in the small room, as if his physical presence alone were enough to command the space around him. He did not offer a greeting, choosing instead to study a small, intricate carving of a hawk on the counter, his expression both distant and piercing. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes were the shade of polished slate, holding an intensity that made Lyra feel as though he were reading the secrets carved into her own soul, rather than merely browsing her wares. It was evident that this man was no ordinary traveler, and in that fleeting, heart-stopping moment, Lyra sensed that the quiet order of her life had reached its inevitable, irreversible turning point. As the stranger continued to observe the shop, his eyes lingered on a series of sketches Lyra had tucked into the corner of her workspace. Drawings of ancient, crumbling archways that mirrored the architecture of the capital's forbidden district. He traced the lines of her work with a gloved finger, and for a split second, a flicker of genuine shock crossed his stern features before he retreated back into his mask of stoic indifference. It was a look of recognition, a spark of connection that suggested he knew exactly what those ruins represented, even if he had no business knowing such things in a remote village like this. Lyra felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up her spine, yet she refused to look away, meeting his gaze with a defiance that seemed to surprise him. She had seen countless men pass through the village, their eyes usually filled with greed or simple exhaustion, but this visitor carried a burden of duty that she recognized all too well from the stories her mother had whispered in the dark. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock that suddenly felt like it was counting down to something far more significant than the end of the day. The man's posture shifted, his shoulders dropping just a fraction, a subtle change that revealed the immense exhaustion he was fighting to keep hidden from the world. He spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate against the wooden walls, asking about the origin of the silk thread she used for her designs. His question was innocuous, yet his tone held a layered complexity, as if every word were a test, designed to peel back the layers of her carefully curated simple life and uncover whatever truth she was working so desperately to bury. Without preamble, he reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat and withdrew a small, tarnished silver medallion that had been snapped in two, placing it gently on the wooden counter between them. He asked Lyra if she could repair the delicate engraving on the metal, his voice losing its professional edge and dropping into a tone of quiet, desperate urgency that defied his stoic exterior. He did not care about the cost, he explained, only that the work be done with total discretion, as if the object itself were a beacon for enemies he was currently trying to outrun. Lyra stared at the broken piece of silver, noticing the faint, faded insignia of a fallen noble house, one that had been purged from history books years ago following a series of brutal political betrayals. She knew that accepting this task was an act of profound danger, a step away from the safety of her anonymity and into the heart of a conflict that had already claimed far too many lives. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden, sharp realization that the past she had fled was currently sitting right in front of her, wrapped in the guise of a weary traveler. "I can fix it," she whispered, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "But you must understand that some things are broken for a reason, and not all of them were meant to be made whole again." The man stared at her for a long time, his gray eyes softening into a look of profound, weary understanding, as if her words had struck a chord he hadn't expected to find in this quiet shop. He agreed to her terms with a slight bow, and in that silent pact, the boundary between Lyra's peaceful present and her turbulent past was officially dissolved, inviting a storm into her sanctuary. Despite the underlying tension and the clear danger radiating from the broken medallion, Lyra invited the man to sit by the warmth of the hearth, while she began the intricate work of restoration. She served him a cup of herbal tea, not because he was a customer, but because she recognized the look of a man who had not known a moment of genuine kindness in years. She treated him with the same gentle grace she afforded her most loyal neighbors, refusing to let the mystery of his identity dictate the level of humanity she offered him. As she worked, the room fell into a comfortable, albeit fragile, rhythm, the clinking of her tools the only sound in the growing twilight. She did not pry into his history, nor did she comment on the strange, jagged scars visible on his wrists, choosing instead to focus on the task at hand, with a serenity that seemed to baffle him. He watched her with a mixture of suspicion and awe, as if the concept of being treated with dignity without having to demand it was a foreign language he was only just beginning to learn. When the hearth fire crackled and cast a golden glow across her face, the stranger finally let his guard down, his eyes losing their sharp, guarded edge for the first time since he had crossed her threshold. It was a fleeting moment of vulnerability, a bridge built between two people living entirely different lives, yet bound together by a shared, unspoken understanding of loss. As she handed him the restored silver, he took it with such reverence that Lyra realized she had not just fixed an object. She had provided him with a tiny, precious anchor in a world that had tried to tear him apart. But as the sun sets, she has no idea that the man she just helped is not a simple traveler, and a storm is already gathering on the horizon of her quiet village. As the days bled into weeks, the artisan's shop became an unlikely sanctuary for the mysterious traveler. They spoke of everything and nothing: the texture of fine silks, the shifting patterns of the seasons, and the quiet dignity of a life lived away from the hollow roar of the capital's high society. Yet, in the spaces between their words, Lyra could feel him testing her, gauging her intellect and her resilience with a precision that bordered on the clinical. He was a man accustomed to deciphering truths from shadows, and he seemed perpetually surprised to find that Lyra's quiet exterior housed a mind both sharp and deeply observant. One rainy afternoon, as the mist clung to the village windows like a shroud, he questioned her about the geopolitical shifts in the distant north, his tone deceptively casual. Lyra, who had spent her youth listening to her father's hushed lectures on statecraft before his sudden, mysterious exile, answered with a nuanced understanding that caught him completely off guard. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. He began to realize that she was far more than a simple shopkeeper, and she began to understand that he was a man holding on to secrets that could reshape the entire kingdom. They found themselves caught in a dance of intellectual sparring, where every question was a challenge, and every answer was a carefully calculated piece of a puzzle. He stopped talking about the weather and started discussing the philosophy of honor, a topic that clearly weighed heavily on his weary soul. Lyra found herself drawn into his orbit, her curiosity blooming into something far more dangerous, as she sensed that behind his guarded demeanor lay a heart that had been systematically broken by the very power he now sought to navigate. The traveler began to spend his evenings in the village tavern, not for the drink, but to piece together the fragments of the woman who held his attention so captive. He learned of her reputation for unfaltering integrity, of her history as a daughter of a disgraced family who had arrived in the village with nothing but a trunk of books and a formidable spirit. He realized that her self-imposed isolation was not a sign of weakness, but a profound act of defiance against a world that had tried to crush her spirit and erase her name. His curiosity shifted from tactical interest to a genuine, burning need to understand what had made her choose this life of silence. He found himself watching her from the periphery of the village square, admiring the way she navigated the petty politics of the neighbors with such effortless grace. Every detail he uncovered, the way she helped the widows with their firewood, the way she never complained about the bitter winters, only served to deepen the growing respect he felt for her, a respect that was rapidly transforming into an overwhelming desire for her presence. Yet he remained cautious, his past experiences teaching him that curiosity often invited calamity. He was a man who lived in a world where information was a currency of blood, and he knew that drawing too close to someone like Lyra could be the very thing that destroyed the fragile peace she had spent years constructing. He was trapped between the man he was forced to be and the man he desperately wanted to become when he was standing within the walls of her quiet, lavender-scented shop. Despite the growing intimacy of their conversations, Lyra remained fiercely protective of the one truth that sat like a stone in her chest: her direct connection to General Thorne. She knew the man in her shop was looking for leverage, looking for an enemy, and she was terrified that his path was destined to intersect with the very man who had orchestrated her father's downfall. She had seen the general's cruelty firsthand, had witnessed the way he dismantled reputations and lives with a single, cold command, and she would not let this stranger become the next casualty in his pursuit of absolute control. She began to speak in riddles whenever the conversation veered too close to military history or the current state of the army. She was an expert at leading him away from the precipice, using her wit to weave distractions that seemed natural but were designed to protect him from the lethal reach of the general's influence. Every time she caught the stranger's eyes narrowing in suspicion, she felt her pulse quicken, knowing that her survival depended on her ability to keep her past locked behind the heavy, silent doors of her heart. The burden of this secret was exhausting, turning her once peaceful nights into a landscape of restless, haunting dreams. She knew that the traveler was not just a drifter, that he possessed the look of someone on a mission, and the terror of what would happen if he discovered her association with Thorne kept her awake long after the village lamps had dimmed. She was playing a dangerous game, one where the stakes were not just her shop or her reputation, but the very possibility of the future she had started to hope for in the presence of this brooding, enigmatic man. The stranger continued his charade, dressing in his worn, layered clothes and taking odd jobs around the village to maintain the facade of a man who belonged to the common struggle. He was masterful at it, never flinching when he had to perform menial tasks, or when the local blacksmith treated him with the casual familiarity reserved for his peers. He thrived on the invisibility his disguise afforded him, believing that the truth of his identity would only bring the weight of judgment and expectation crashing down upon him. He was meticulously careful to leave no trace of his past life. He spoke with the rough, unpolished vernacular of the traveling merchant, and he never allowed his true level of education to bleed into his conversations with the villagers. Only in Lyra's presence did his guard sometimes slip, the mask of the commoner momentarily replaced by the steely, calculated gaze of a leader accustomed to being obeyed without question. It was a slip she always noticed, a subtle shift in his bearing that made her heart race with the sudden, undeniable suspicion that he was royalty in a beggar's rags. The strain of living a double life began to take its toll on him, visible in the way he would sometimes stare into the distance with an expression of profound, soul-deep fatigue. He wanted nothing more than to be the man he pretended to be, a man free from the labyrinthine plots of the nobility and the suffocating pressure of his true heritage. But the truth was a heavy, persistent shadow that followed him into every room, and he knew that the longer he maintained his disguise, the more impossible it would become to ever be honest with the woman who was rapidly becoming the center of his world. Lyra's skepticism was no longer a dull ache. It had sharpened into a clear, cutting clarity that made it impossible to ignore the gaps in his story. She began to notice the small, inconsistent details, the way he instinctively checked for weapons in his coat during a sudden noise, the way his hands moved with the refined dexterity of someone taught to use a rapier, and the occasional lapses in his carefully practiced dialect. It was as if he were a beautifully crafted statue, with a hidden, jagged crack running through the center, waiting for the slightest pressure to break him wide open. She tested him, posing questions about noble customs and the internal politics of the capital that only a member of the elite would truly understand. His answers, while clever, carried a precise, encyclopedic knowledge that far exceeded the experience of any simple traveler she had ever met. The more he tried to deflect, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, painting a picture of a man who was deeply, inextricably linked to the very world she had spent her life trying to escape. The suspicion in her heart was accompanied by a rising sense of betrayal, a cold realization that the man she was beginning to trust might be the most dangerous person to ever walk into her shop. She felt a profound sadness at the thought that their bond, however brief, was built on a foundation of deception. She wanted to believe in the man behind the mask, but she was trapped between the desire to confront him and the paralyzing fear that once the truth was spoken, there would be no turning back to the safety of their simple, quiet interactions. The tension between them is just beginning to boil over. If you're curious to see how a duke will handle the truth, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss our next upload. The village of Oakhaven was rarely touched by the grand, suffocating opulence of the capital, but an announcement arrived like a lightning strike. A masquerade ball was to be hosted at the crumbling ancestral estate of the local marquis, an event meant to honor the arrival of the region's most powerful military commanders. It was a gala designed for political posturing, where masks would serve not to hide identities, but to facilitate the treacherous maneuvering of the highborn. For Lyra, the news was a source of cold dread. She knew that where such men gathered, the past was never far behind, and the shadow of the general loomed over the entire valley like a coming winter storm. The village transformed overnight, an ugly metamorphosis of forced gaiety and frantic preparation. Merchants from the capital arrived with crates of silk gowns that shimmered like dragon scales under the lanterns, and the local inn was commandeered by officers whose boots clicked rhythmically against the cobblestones, a constant menacing reminder of their authority. Lyra found herself forced to create elaborate adornments for the local aristocrats, her fingers stitching golden thread into velvet bodices, while her mind raced with ways to avoid the event entirely. She felt like a trapped bird, observing the flurry of activity as if from behind a thick, impenetrable pane of glass. The night of the ball, the estate was a beacon of artificial light that bled into the surrounding woods. Carriages lined the narrow lanes, their horses' breath misting in the frigid air, while the sound of a string quartet, sharp, precise, and utterly devoid of soul, drifted across the damp fields. Lyra, tasked with delivering a final lace trimming for the Marquess's daughter, stood at the edge of the estate's grand stone terrace, watching the masked figures move in a slow, elegant, and deceptive carousel. It was a tableau of power and pretense, and she felt the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched from the shadows of the arched colonnade. Just as Lyra turned to retreat into the comforting darkness of the village road, she saw him. But it was not the man she had hosted in her hearth-warmed shop. He stood on the grand staircase, his frame clad not in worn wool, but in a tailored coat of obsidian silk that fit his broad shoulders, as if it had been forged onto him by a master smith. The mask he wore was minimalist, carved from dark, polished wood, but it was his posture that struck her most. The slight slouch of the traveler had vanished, replaced by the rigid, commanding grace of a predator who had finally dropped the illusion of being prey. Every movement he made was imbued with a lethal, effortless authority that silenced the sycophants surrounding him. He moved through the crowd as if the air itself parted to make way for him, his head held high, scanning the room with a cold, analytical brilliance that had been entirely absent during his hours in her store. He did not look like a man hiding. He looked like a man who owned the night, a silent apex of power whose very presence seemed to drain the color from the surrounding revelry. Lyra stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, realizing with a sick, sinking feeling that the man she had grown to trust was a stranger she hadn't even begun to know. He stopped in the center of the ballroom, his gaze momentarily sweeping over the terrace, and for an agonizing second, their eyes locked across the distance. He did not bow, nor did he wave. He simply stood there, a dark monolith of unspoken truth in a room full of gilded lies. The atmosphere around him was no longer just charged. It was heavy with the weight of expectation and the terrifying realization that his appearance here had dismantled the carefully constructed peace Lyra had guarded. The man she had served tea to was dead. In his place stood a titan of the aristocracy, and the sight of him made her realize just how deep the deception had been. He thinks he is in control of the situation, but the mask he wears is beginning to slip, and the woman he underestimated is the only one who can see the truth. The revelation came not from him, but from the hushed, terrified whispers of the servants clustering in the shadows of the pantry. As Lyra moved to fulfill her final delivery, the name was passed between them like a contagion. The Duke of Valerius. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. Valerius was not merely a title. It was a name synonymous with the most influential, ruthless, and historically significant lineage in the realm. A family whose wealth could buy kingdoms and whose influence had dictated the outcome of a dozen wars. The pieces of her internal puzzle shattered and rearranged themselves into a portrait of absolute betrayal. She realized now why he had checked for weapons, why he knew the language of statecraft so intimately, and why he looked at the world with such a deep, corrosive cynicism. He hadn't been hiding from bandits or creditors. He had been navigating a private war against the very institutions of power he represented. The broken medallion he had asked her to fix was not a keepsake of a disgraced house. It was a seal of the Valerius legacy, a remnant of a power that had been nearly extinguished by the same regime that currently commanded the general. Her world tilted on its axis, the ground beneath her feet feeling suddenly fragile and treacherous. She had treated him as a man of the people, an equal in their shared simplicity, while he had been playing a dangerous, high-stakes game that she was never supposed to enter. Every smile, every shared silence, every lingering touch had been tainted by the monumental lie of his existence. The Duke of Valerius was not a man who could be loved in a village shop. He was a political entity, a weapon of the state, and the realization that she had been lured into his orbit left her feeling hollow and utterly exposed. Lyra retreated to the back of the estate, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps as she leaned against a cold stone wall in the garden, trying to scrub the image of him in his obsidian coat from her mind. The disappointment wasn't just a surface-level feeling. It was a profound, aching betrayal that seemed to seep into her very bones, poisoning the memory of every kindness she had extended to him. She had believed they were two souls seeking refuge from the cruelty of the world, only to find that she was just another piece on his board, another element in his complex, hidden strategy. She felt a surge of hot, bitter anger rising against her own naivety. How could she have been so blind? How could she have let herself believe that a man with hands shaped by the blade would ever truly seek the solace of a life spent with thread and silk? She had opened her heart to a man she thought she understood, only to discover that the heart she had reached for was encased in armor that she had no hope of piercing. The simplicity she had cherished in him was nothing more than an act, a theatrical performance meant to keep her quiet and compliant until he was ready to move on. She clutched her shawl tighter against the biting wind, the silence of the garden reflecting the sudden, hollow silence within her. He had lied to her with every breath, every look, and every word, and the damage of that lie was absolute. She wasn't just grieving for the man she thought he was. She was grieving for the loss of her own sanctuary, the loss of her ability to trust that anyone, even someone as weary and broken as the traveler, could ever be what they appeared to be. Her disappointment was a jagged knife, and it cut through the last remnants of her romantic illusions, leaving her cold, solitary, and infinitely stronger. Betrayal is a heavy price to pay for love. If you're enjoying this dramatic turn, please subscribe to our channel and join our community of story lovers. Lyra's escape was short-lived. A firm, heavy hand touched her shoulder, and the scent of cold winter air and faint cedar wood confirmed his presence before he even spoke. He had followed her into the garden, his obsidian coat dark against the moonlight, his expression fractured by an uncharacteristic flicker of genuine panic. He didn't offer a platitude or a shallow apology. He simply stood there, his eyes pleading for a shred of the empathy she had once so easily given him, his own posture now broken and exposed. "I could not come to you as the man the world expects me to be," he began, his voice low and vibrating with a raw, unfiltered desperation that seemed to echo through the empty garden. He explained, in rapid, breathless sentences, the web of surveillance and assassination attempts that had forced him to cast aside his name and his life. He had been a man hunted by his own allies, betrayed by the very crown he was expected to protect, and the mask of the traveler had been the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave in the forest. His explanation was frantic, a torrent of political secrets and existential threats that were meant to justify his secrecy. But Lyra only felt a growing, icy detachment. He spoke of duty, of honor, and of survival, but he did not speak of the truth he had denied her from the very start. As she looked at him, she didn't see the heroic victim of political intrigue. She saw a man who had chosen to deceive her to protect his own survival, sacrificing her trust on the altar of his own convenience. The explanation, while logical, was the final nail in the coffin of their connection, and she turned her head away, unable to look at the man who had traded his soul for the safety of a shopkeeper's anonymity. Lyra listened to his justifications, but each word felt like a hollow strike against a drum that had long since stopped echoing. The Duke spoke of survival and political necessity, but his logic was cold and calculated, the language of a man who viewed human interactions as assets to be managed rather than bonds to be cherished. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the distance between his aristocratic world and her quiet life as an insurmountable chasm, one that he had attempted to bridge with a carefully crafted lie rather than an honest hand. Her resistance was not born of spite, but of a fundamental refusal to be a pawn in his high-stakes survival. Every time he stepped closer, attempting to capture her hand or soften his tone, she felt a tightening in her chest, not of attraction, but of a defensive instinct screaming that he was dangerous, not because of his enemies, but because of his fundamental inability to be vulnerable without a motive. She realized that even now, he was trying to win her understanding, treating her forgiveness as a strategic objective to be achieved, rather than a grace to be earned. "You speak of survival, my lord," she finally said, her voice cutting through the damp garden air with a chilling precision. "But you survived at the cost of the only thing that made me trust you. The truth." He recoiled as if she had struck him, his aristocratic composure cracking to reveal a man who was utterly unequipped to handle the sting of a woman who didn't care about his title or his plight. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that marked the end of the illusion they had built together, leaving him standing alone in the shadows of the garden while she turned back toward the village. She walked away from him, believing she was safe. But the general's arrival in town proves that nobody in this village is beyond his reach. The following morning, the atmosphere in Oakhaven shifted from celebratory to oppressive as a column of armored cavalry thundered through the main street, their heavy steel armor glinting like broken glass under the pale sun. General Thorne had arrived, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was surpassed only by his penchant for absolute cruelty. He did not travel as a guest. He traveled as a conqueror, his presence turning the village square into a staging ground for his own unchecked authority. The general's demands were posted in the town hall before noon: a total census of the local population, the immediate seizure of all private workshops for military production, and the imposition of a harsh martial law that effectively stripped the villagers of their remaining autonomy. Thorne sat at the head of the village square, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the faces of the terrified shopkeepers, as if they were nothing more than insects beneath a magnifying glass. Lyra, watching from the safety of her shop window, felt the blood drain from her face when the general's gaze lingered on her door. A lingering, knowing look that suggested he knew exactly who she was and what she was trying to hide. The fear that gripped the village was palpable, a thick, suffocating dread that silenced the birds and kept the children indoors. Thorne's men began their systematic search, tearing through the homes of the villagers with a cavalier disregard for property or dignity, searching for anyone who might be hiding seditionists or enemies of the crown. It was a calculated campaign of terror, and Lyra knew with chilling certainty that the general had not come for the village. He had come for the Duke of Valerius, and he was prepared to turn Oakhaven into a graveyard to draw him out of hiding. Lyra made the decision in the quiet, agonizing moments before the general's men reached her door. Instead of cowering or fleeing, she marched out into the square, her head held high, her apron stained with the ink of her work, and walked directly toward the man who had ruined her family's life. Thorne watched her approach with a twisted, mocking smile, clearly amused by the audacity of a woman who dared to challenge his authority. But his laughter died in his throat when she reached the edge of his table and leaned in, whispering into his ear. She didn't speak of pleas or petitions. She spoke of the secret she had guarded since her father's exile. A specific, dated set of documents and financial ledgers that proved Thorne had been orchestrating a treasonous rebellion against the throne for years, using the very military budget he was supposed to guard. It was an earth-shattering truth, one that, if brought to the light of the royal court, would result in his immediate execution for high treason. The general went deathly pale, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword, his composure fracturing into a mosaic of sheer, unadulterated terror. The square fell into a state of unnatural silence as the two figures stood locked in that lethal, whispered exchange. The soldiers surrounding them shifted nervously, unable to understand what could have paralyzed their commander so completely, but Thorne didn't dare move. He knew that Lyra held the knife at his throat, and that one wrong move would mean his end. She drew back, her eyes cold and steady, and gave him a faint, dangerous smile that promised nothing but his total annihilation if he did not leave the village at once. The Duke of Valerius had watched the entire confrontation from the shadows of an alleyway, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. When Lyra turned and began walking back toward her shop, passing the Duke's hidden position, he stepped forward, his face a mask of absolute, devastating shock. He had heard her words, not all of them, but enough to know that she had possessed the power to destroy the general all along, a power she had kept hidden even while he was being hunted, tortured, and forced into exile. He caught her arm, his grip firm but trembling, and pulled her into the darkness of the alley, his eyes searching hers for some sign of the woman he thought he knew. The realization that she had been holding the key to his own salvation, the very evidence he had spent years trying to find, left him reeling. He was a man who prided himself on his intelligence, his strategy, and his control. Yet he stood now in the shadow of a woman whose courage and foresight dwarfed his own, feeling an overwhelming, crushing sense of his own inadequacy. "You had it," he whispered, his voice cracking, the weight of the years of his own struggle suddenly crashing down upon him. "You had the proof that could have ended this madness years ago, and you kept it hidden." He looked at her, not with anger, but with a profound, humble reverence that bordered on pain. The arrogance of the Duke, the pretense of the traveler, and the weight of his title all seemed to dissolve in the face of her sacrifice, and he was left in a state of absolute, shattering silence, forced to confront the fact that the woman he had tried to manipulate was, in truth, the only person who had ever been his superior. The Duke walked back to his quarters at the inn, the heavy ornate seal of the Valerius house resting in his pocket like a burning coal. The revelation Lyra had forced upon the general was not just a political maneuver. It was a devastating indictment of the very system his own family had helped to build. If Thorne was guilty of such corruption, how many other loyal servants of the throne were equally stained? He realized that his family's honor, the pristine legacy he had been groomed to protect since birth, was built on a foundation of complicity and quiet acceptance of the rot within the kingdom. He sat by the window for hours, staring out at the moonlit village, the weight of the truth pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He had spent his life thinking he was the hero of his own story, a noble protector of the realm, only to have his entire worldview dismantled by a woman who had nothing but her own integrity. He was a Valerius, and the Valerius name was supposed to represent the pinnacle of justice. Instead, it had become a symbol of the blindness that had allowed the general to fester in the first place. His honor felt like a fragile, hollow shell, and as he turned the silver medallion in his hand, he felt the crushing realization that he could never return to the life he had known before. Lyra had offered him a mirror, and he hated the man he saw reflected within it. A man who had been so obsessed with his own suffering that he had been blind to the courage of others. He knew now that the path to redemption would not be found in the halls of power, but in the difficult, agonizing process of dismantling his own arrogance and proving that he was worthy of the woman who had just changed his world forever. Lyra knew that the fragile equilibrium of her life had been permanently shattered, and the sight of the Duke standing in the shadows of the alley had only confirmed her worst fears. She was inextricably linked to a game of power she had spent a lifetime trying to escape. The following morning, she did not open her shop. Instead, she spent the hours packing the few personal belongings that truly mattered. A trunk of her father's journals, the silver tools of her craft, and the memories of a life that, for a few brief weeks, had felt like it might finally be her own. She was not running away in cowardice. She was making a tactical retreat to preserve the one thing she had left: her autonomy. The village felt different now, imbued with a sense of impending chaos that made the air feel thin and sharp. She moved with a calculated, quiet efficiency, boarding the windows of her sanctuary and securing the heavy oak door that had welcomed so many, including the man who had ultimately brought the storm to her doorstep. She felt a profound, aching sorrow for the shop, for the quiet peace of her morning rituals, and for the man she had allowed herself to imagine a future with. But she knew that to stay in Oakhaven was to invite his enemies, his history, and his inevitable downfall into her home. As she dragged her small trunk toward the rear gate, she didn't look back at the village square, where the soldiers were still patrolling with their cold, predatory intent. She was a woman who understood the gravity of her own worth, and she refused to be a footnote in the tragic history of the Valerius name. Her decision to leave was an act of supreme self-preservation, a quiet declaration that her life, her peace, and her future were not secondary to the ambitions or the redemption of a nobleman who had taken too long to show her the truth. The Duke arrived at the shop shortly after dawn, his expression softened by a restless night of self-reflection and the desperate hope of an apology, only to be met by the jarring sight of a boarded-up door. The silence of the shop was deafening, a visceral physical presence that hit him with more force than any battlefield blow he had ever endured. He stood before the entrance for a long time, his hand hovering over the wood where Lyra had once stood, his mind reeling as the absolute, crushing reality of her departure settled over him. He had thought that by explaining his past, he could clear a path toward forgiveness. He had been fatally wrong. He realized then, with a clarity that was both searing and pathetic, that he had never actually seen Lyra as an equal until it was far too late. He had treated their relationship as a strategic maneuver, a puzzle he could manage with the right words and the right justifications, never once pausing to consider that she was a woman whose integrity was not for sale or negotiation. He had relied on his title to protect him. But it was his title, and the secrets that came with it, that had driven the only woman he had ever truly admired out into the cold. The weight of his own hubris was a physical burden, pinning him to the spot as the village began to wake around him. He looked at the empty street, the path she must have taken, and saw the wreckage of his own making. He had been a man who spent his life surrounded by sycophants and spies, and in his desperation to protect his secret, he had treated the one person who offered him genuine, unvarnished humanity with the same suspicion he used on his enemies. The irony was a bitter, choking pill. He had finally found someone who didn't care about his lineage, yet he had been so busy protecting that lineage that he had destroyed the only thing that made him feel truly alive. He turned away from the shop, a man who had everything, yet had realized he possessed absolutely nothing of value. He realized he lost her, but a man of his stature is used to getting what he wants, even if it means risking everything he has built to win her back. The Duke did not return to the estate. Instead, he threw himself into the hunt for Lyra, his own vast network of spies, the very people he had tried so hard to hide from, suddenly turned toward a singular, desperate objective. He bypassed the general's men, ignored the political urgencies of the capital, and moved through the countryside with a singular, relentless focus that startled his own men. He was not looking for a political ally or a military tactical advantage. He was looking for the woman whose absence had left a void in his life that no amount of power or title could ever fill. His search was not the elegant work of a nobleman. It was the frantic, raw pursuit of a man who realized he had made the most catastrophic error of his life. He found her scent, the faint, lingering smell of lavender and old paper, at an inn 3 villages over, and he knew he was closing the gap. He was no longer trying to manage the situation. He was prepared to lay everything on the line, to abandon his quest for revenge against Thorne, and to step out into the light, completely vulnerable. If it meant he could just see her one more time and beg for a chance to explain the man he truly was beneath the mask. He moved through the mud and the driving rain, his obsidian coat ruined, his dignity forgotten, his mind solely fixed on the hope that she hadn't yet reached the city gates. He was fighting his own nature, fighting the years of conditioning that told him to protect his name at all costs. And finally, for the first time in his adult life, he was acting without a plan. He had no speech prepared, no strategic leverage, and no guarantee that she would even speak to him. He only knew that to stop searching now would be to accept a death far worse than any General Thorne could ever inflict upon him. The convergence occurred in the ruins of the ancient stone bridge, a place that held the weight of history and the shadows of the past. General Thorne, having intercepted reports of the Duke's frantic search, had arrived with a small elite guard, hoping to end the political threat of the Valerius name once and for all. As the Duke arrived at the bridge, he found the general waiting, his men spread out in a lethal formation, the air filled with the scent of ozone and the tension of imminent, unavoidable violence. The general smiled, a predatory, gloating expression, believing that the Duke's obsession with the artisan had finally led him into a trap from which he would never return. The Duke stood his ground, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, his presence no longer that of a hidden traveler, but of a man who had nothing left to lose. He did not speak of treaties, of royal decrees, or of the legalities of their conflict. He spoke of the corruption Lyra had uncovered, and the evidence he now held. A truth so explosive that the general's own guards began to shift their footing, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. The confrontation was not a clash of steel, but a clash of reality, as the Duke presented the ledgers Lyra had identified, forcing the general to see that his ambition had finally hit the bedrock of an undeniable public truth. The atmosphere on the bridge became a pressure cooker of political ruin. As the Duke detailed the betrayal, the general's soldiers, men who had been fed a diet of lies for years, began to realize that their leader was nothing more than a common, treasonous opportunist. Thorne's command, once absolute, began to dissolve as his own men realized that the man they had sworn to follow was destined for the gallows. The Duke remained calm, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the general, not as an opponent, but as a man who had finally understood that power was nothing if it wasn't built upon the foundation of an unshakable, public, and absolute honesty. The final moment of the confrontation was surprisingly quiet, a stark contrast to the violence that had been expected. Thorne, stripped of his authority and surrounded by the very men he had betrayed, made one last, desperate attempt to invoke his rank. But the sound of his voice was drowned out by the arrival of a royal judicial party, alerted by the Duke's swift, preceding actions. The general was disarmed without a single blow, his arrogance collapsing as he realized that the truth Lyra had cultivated had spread faster than his own influence ever could. The victory was not a triumph of arms, but a total, crushing triumph of clarity. The Duke stood amidst the wreckage of Thorne's command, feeling not the surge of conquest, but a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. He had successfully cleared the path, not for his own advancement, but for the possibility that he might one day walk through the world without a lie attached to his name. He watched as the general was led away, a broken man whose only contribution to the world had been the misery he had caused, and he realized that the arrogance he had once admired in Thorne was simply the reflection of the same arrogance he had been carrying within himself. He walked to the edge of the bridge, the rain finally stopping, and looked out across the valley toward the road where Lyra had gone. The victory of truth over arrogance was a monumental achievement. But as he stood there, alone in the silence that followed the departure of the military party, he knew that the real victory was still waiting for him. He had broken the hold of his past. He had dismantled the architecture of the general's power, and he had finally stripped away the final layers of his own deception. But none of it would matter if he didn't have the courage to face the woman who had forced him to see the truth. With the general's influence dismantled, Kaelen did not return to the comforts of the capital or the hollow applause of his peers. He used his remaining influence to secure the release of the families Thorne had unjustly imprisoned, and he personally oversaw the redistribution of the lands that had been stolen from the villagers of Oakhaven. He was no longer the man who hid behind the mask of a traveler. He was a man who understood that true honor wasn't found in his lineage, but in the restoration of the lives that his own world had discarded as collateral. He spent his own fortune commissioning the reconstruction of the village square, not as a monument to his house, but as a public space where the citizens could reclaim their sense of unity. He did not seek recognition for these actions. In fact, he worked from the shadows, ensuring that the credit went to local leaders who had endured the brunt of the general's cruelty. It was a humble, painstaking effort to prove, through the sweat of his brow and the reallocation of his resources, that he was finally ready to carry the weight of his own morality. These were not the gestures of a duke seeking to regain political standing, but the deliberate, weary actions of a man who was cleaning his own soul. He had finally learned that the value of his name was tied entirely to how he used it to serve those who had been deemed insignificant by the aristocracy. Every stone laid in the village and every contract signed for the benefit of the oppressed felt like a penance, a necessary step in the slow, agonizing process of becoming a man who was truly worthy of his title. Kaelen finally tracked Lyra to a small coastal town where she had begun to rebuild her life in a quiet workshop overlooking the sea. He did not arrive with a retinue of guards or the fanfare of his nobility. He came alone, walking the long, winding path to her door with the same trepidation of a man facing his final judgment. He stopped at the edge of the dunes, watching her from a distance as she worked, her silhouette framed against the vast, shifting horizon, feeling a profound, aching vulnerability that he had never dared to show before. He waited for days, maintaining a respectful distance, ensuring she felt no threat, no pressure, and no sense of obligation to see him. He took work as a laborer at the local shipyard, allowing his hands to grow rough and tired, showing her through his daily life that he had learned the dignity of true labor. It was a slow, agonizing process of proving, without words, that the arrogance of the Duke of Valerius had been effectively, permanently laid to rest. He was content to be a stranger in the periphery of her world, hoping that his presence would eventually lose its sting of betrayal. One evening, as the tide receded, he finally approached her porch, leaving a small, simple gift, a handful of sea glass and a set of professional tools he had commissioned from the village's best smith. He did not stay to watch her open them. He simply bowed and began to retreat, his heart heavy with the weight of his past failures. But just as he turned the corner to the path home, he heard the soft, familiar click of her gate opening, a sound that stopped him in his tracks and filled the air with a fragile electric possibility he had long since ceased to believe in. Lyra stood on the porch, the tools in her hands, her eyes searching his face not for the mask of the traveler or the arrogance of the Duke, but for the man who had worked the shipyards for weeks without complaining of the sun or the sweat. Kaelen fell to his knees on the wooden steps, not as a gesture of rank, but as a genuine, shattering admission of his own inadequacy. He spoke not of politics or secrets, but of the loneliness he had endured and the profound, transformative regret he felt for having traded her trust for his own security. He confessed that he had not come to win her back for his own sake, but because the man he had become was a reflection of the strength he had discovered in her. He asked for her forgiveness, acknowledging that it was a grace he didn't deserve, but one he needed if he was to have any hope of living a life of integrity. He laid his title, his history, and his pride at her feet, and for the first time he was not trying to win a game. He was offering her the entirety of his life, with no expectation of an immediate answer. Lyra looked down at him, the man who had once tried to manipulate her world, and saw that he was finally empty of the secrets that had once defined him. She saw the marks of his labor on his hands, and the exhaustion etched into his soul, and for the first time since the night of the ball, she felt the bitterness begin to recede, replaced by a cautious, simmering warmth. She did not forgive him instantly. She did not promise that the pain was gone, but she stepped off the porch and stood beside him, a quiet, non-verbal acknowledgement that the door to his redemption had not been slammed shut, The journey toward reconciliation was not a straight line, but a series of quiet, deliberate choices to exist within the same space and rebuild the foundation of their bond. Lyra allowed him into her workshop. Not as a duke, but as a man who was willing to learn the rhythm of her life, to understand the value of her craft, and to respect the boundaries she set with the ironclad certainty of a woman who knew her own worth. They spent weeks in a state of tentative peace, learning to speak to one another without the baggage of past deceptions, discovering the people they were when the world wasn't looking. Lyra made the decision to trust him again, not because he was powerful, or because his title held any sway in her shop, but because he had proven his commitment through action, patience, and the shedding of his own ego. She chose an honest future, a life where the truth was the only currency they exchanged, and where the masks of the past had no place. She recognized that the man he was becoming wasn't a man who needed to dominate or manipulate, but a man who was finally learning how to listen. She stood with him on the cliffside, the vast, open ocean stretching out before them, and she placed her hand in his, a final, definitive seal on their pact. They were not seeking a life of aristocratic perfection or the hollow glory of the capital. They were choosing a life of quiet, deliberate honesty, where their future was determined not by their pedigree, but by the strength of the bond they had forged in the ruins of his deception. It was a choice for a simple, resilient happiness, and as they looked out toward the horizon, they knew the weight of the past had finally been left behind. The final scene of their story was not set in a grand ballroom or an ancestral estate, but in the small, sun-drenched workshop by the sea, where the scent of lavender and salt water mingled in the air. Kaelen had officially renounced his claims to the political machinations of his house, leaving the management of his legacy to those who cared for the bureaucracy of power, and had instead dedicated himself to a life of quiet service and partnership. He was a man who had finally discovered that the only honor worth possessing was the honor of being trusted by the woman who had seen through every one of his lies. They were a man and a woman who had come through the fire and emerged, not as the people the world expected, but as the people they had chosen to be. It was the beginning of a chapter that belonged entirely to them, a life anchored in the truth. And as they watched the light fade, they knew that for the first time in their lives, they were finally, truly home. The golden sun dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sea in hues of violet and fire, mirroring the warmth that had finally taken root in their hearts. Hand in hand, they turned back toward the glow of their shop, leaving the shadows of their pasts to be swallowed by the rising tide. In the quiet rhythm of the waves and the steady beat of their united hearts, they found the peace they had searched for in every corner of the kingdom, a promise kept, a truth embraced, and a love that would remain as constant as the coming dawn. This story is a reminder that truth, however painful, is the only foundation upon which a real life can be built. If this journey of love and restoration touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your thoughts on Lyra's final choice, and share this video with a friend who needs a good story today.